Good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to all of you. It's a tremendous pleasure to welcome Michael Keating, who is the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Somalia, and welcoming him back to this IPI Policy Forum. This is, I believe, your third time here. And Mr. Keating, why don't we both sit down here and relax, has spoken here on Afghanistan, on humanitarian issues, on Somalia. So we have a real wonderful expert here with us today, and he's here this week to speak to the Security Council on Friday on current developments in Somalia. IPI here, and my colleagues that I want to thank for setting this up, has followed and supported the international community's continuing role to assist rebuilding the Somali state and to end the civil war in that country ever since the state fell in 1991 when Siad Barre fell. So 26 years later, here we are, 26 years later, that effort continues. And in the former Secretary General's remarks, Ban Ki-moon's remarks in September, among other things, he commented that Somalia was once a byword for state failure, but today appears a precious, if fragile, testament to the possibilities of peace building as Somalia embarks on a transition of power to a new legislature and executive, a watershed moment and a milestone on the road to becoming a fully fledged, inclusive, and stable democratic state. 10 years ago, nobody would have believed it was possible. So this is a huge step, and the United Nations, under your leadership and that of your predecessors, has played a really major role in supporting the Somali state. The simultaneous movement of UN offices from Nairobi to Mogadishu and the ongoing efforts of the African Union Mission in Somalia since 2012 reflect the convergence of these international efforts. The limited parliamentary election of 2012 and the electoral process of 2016, which has just been completed, are important steps toward a universal, that's the language of the UN report, a universal nationwide election to take place in 2020. At the same time, as I think we all are aware, Al-Shabab and other radical elements and forces remain active in the south, facing the African Union mission in Somalia, AMISOM, with a continued security challenge. So I really want to thank all of you for coming here today. It shows the interest of Somalia, in Somalia here, and of course we're webcasting this, so a lot of other people are concerned and committed to helping the Somali state. So I want to thank you for coming here today to share your perspective on these very complex challenges and to tell us a little bit how you see the international and national efforts toward a truly sustainable state. So I've asked Mr. Keating to speak informally here for about 15 minutes or so, whatever you're comfortable with, and then he and I will have a discussion briefly, and then we'll open it up for questions. So before we start, please turn off your cell phones. If you have to have a phone call, please go out in the hallway. And again, thank you all for being here. Mr. Keating.
Thank you so much, John. And my primary concern is whether my headpiece is going to stay in.
I share that too. This thing is wobbling on my ear.
The course of the discussion. It's a real privilege for me to be back at IPI, so thank you for extending that honor to me. And great to see so many people in the room, including many familiar faces, and I suspect some people who know Somalia better than I do. I don't know how many Somalis there are in the room. How many Somalis in the room? One.
Bravo.
One.
At least you.
Delighted that you're here, sir. You began by talking about the role of the UN, and I just want to begin by saying it is an extraordinary privilege to have the job that I have. because there are not that many places in the world where the UN is such an important actor, both to the international community and to the host authorities and to civil society. And fun enough, we're going through something called a strategic assessment, an exercise we do every 4 years. One of the things we do is ask everybody what they think of the UN, what their expectations are of Somalia, and what they want the UN role to be. And even though there are some sort of snipey comments like the best thing you can do is go away or something, most people, we've been really very gratified to discover, want more UN, not less, whether it's civil society, the government, the security establishment, and the international community. So to be leading a mission where the UN occupies a really very, very significant role is a privilege, and not one that I've had before, actually, anywhere I've served, where it is indisputably the main actor. And its ability to play that role depends upon its responsiveness to member states as well as to the Somali's own aspirations. In our chat, John, beforehand, you said, could I talk about the politics, the security, and the economics?
Yes.
So I'll try and do that briefly. Maybe some of you are following what's happening in Somalia, so forgive me if I'm taking too broad a canvas on this, but essentially what's going on in Somalia is a state that is reinventing itself. It is trying to figure out what forms of governance and accountability are going to work in a country which has had a very turbulent 30, 40, 50 years, characterized by state collapse, characterized by desperate insecurity. I think a lot of people compete for the dubious merit of being the worst place in the world to be a woman, but I think Somalia probably takes the biscuit in terms of absence of basic services, life expectancy, literacy, and all the rest of it. But as you said, it's a country that is slowly coming together, and most of the problems that Somalia is facing are the problems of a country that is trying to sort itself out, not a country that is ripping itself apart. There is still Al-Shabab, which remains a threat, and we'll come back to that. But let me talk about the three things that you mentioned. On the politics, the main challenge of the last few years has been to, in a way, create an architecture for the state. And 2 months ago, we saw the final main piece in that architecture put in place. It's a federal state that is being constructed, and the last federal member state was created at Hirshabelle in November. So at the most sort of basic level, we now have the architecture of a federal state. But as of those of you who come from federal countries, what federalism means is another matter. It can mean almost anything you want, but it means that some things belong to people at a local level and some things need to be shared. And there is a big discussion going on in almost every domain, whether it's justice, agriculture, education, security, policing. What is it that should be at the state level and should it be at the national level? So there's a big state formation discussion taking place, and we have a number of nascent states that have created. I think the second big feature on the political landscape has been the electoral process. And I would describe it actually as a political process, more accurately as a political process with strong electoral features. What has happened over the last 6 months and what is yet to be concluded, is not a typical election. It is, a few years ago, the Somalis wanted to set themselves a target of having one person, one vote elections in 2016, but that proved impossible because the infrastructure that is required to have one person, one vote elections is simply not in place. There isn't a voter registry, The court system is pretty limited. The security situation didn't lend itself to it, and so on. So what we've had over the last 6 months is an electoral process that is dramatically better than 2012, but still a long way from one person, one vote, which is now scheduled for 2020. And it's been a messy process. And I would like to think that elections, in a way, just hold a mirror up to a society. And what the Somalis have seen in that mirror about how political power works has not been entirely to their liking, because it has been characterized by a lot of corruption and bribery and harassment and fraud and all the rest of it. Many, many problems which are not, have not been created by the electoral process, but are a reflection of the way Somalia works. And in a way, it's a good thing that that mirror has been held up to the Somalis, because I think there's now a strong determination to move beyond that going forward, to learn the lessons of this exercise and to have genuinely one person, one vote elections in 2020. So just for those of you who don't know, parliamentary elections were concluded more or less by the end of 2016 just, and we're now in the process of forming the speakers of the new upper house, and the existing lower house have been chosen, and there will be an election of a president in the next couple of weeks. Okay. This is it's delayed, but the reason that the schedule for the elections has been delayed is because the electoral process has been used, I think, inevitably but misguidedly, to try and resolve all the disputes within Somali society, between clans, between states, and an electoral process cannot bear that strain. So an awful lot of this process has been about, trying to reach agreements as to how MPs will be selected and chosen and elected, and what the procedure is going to be, and each one has involved a discussion between clans and sub-clans and between states. So in some ways it's remarkable that we've had an electoral process at all, and it has yielded some extraordinary results. 25% of the parliamentarians are women, which is truly extraordinary. 6 months ago, we were anticipating that the electoral process would literally be blown up by Al-Shabab. That has not happened. We're not yet through it. There could still be, because the process is now moved to Mogadishu, so that still remains a threat. But to the degree that there's been violence, it's been more between candidates than from Al-Shabab. The process has taken place around the country, which it did not in 2012. And there has been massive political mobilization. In 2012, 135 male elders chose 275 MPs. This time round, the 135 elders chose electoral colleges, and it's ended up that about 13,000 people have then elected the 275 MPs. And each of those 13,000 to 14,000 people themselves has had to be chosen. So you can see, even though it's a fairly limited electoral process, the number of people who have been involved has been extensive. And the other important feature of it, of the many I could list, is that there is a new upper house. And that is very significant in Somalia, because the lower house is basically being formed along clan lines, and the upper house is being formed on the basis of geographical representation from the states. So for the first time, you have a body at the center which is genuinely national rather than clan-based. So even though the process has been very messy, the outcomes of it, I think, are very positive and bode well, potentially, for Somalia to address some of the challenges that it faces. I think other aspects of the political scene, of course, are the degree to which Somalia is in a difficult neighborhood. Many Somalis complain and believe that Somalia is a playground for countries, neighbors, and more distant countries to play out their rivalries, and certainly there is an element of that. But I have to say that the Somalis are becoming more assertive about what it is that they want as they gradually establish political institutional capacity. On the socioeconomic side, I would say the biggest feature right now is the drought. You may know that the whole Horn region is affected by the drought. We are very, very worried about this. I forget the name of the organization. Is it FuseNet? Is that what it's called? Who knows about these things? It's issued a pre-famine warning, which is very, very alarming. And we have issued a drought response appeal. It was the Famine Early Warning Network, issued by the FSNAU, and approximately $300 million is now being sought to try and respond to this drought. Now, clearly, I'm not the humanitarian coordinator, and the humanitarian coordinator is spearheading the response to this. But I'm very concerned about this drought as well, because many of the political gains that have been made over the last years will be challenged by the drought if it turns into something very, very serious. First of all, the credibility of any new government and any emerging local authorities will rest upon the degree to which they are seen as being able to respond to the drought. Secondly, drought exacerbates conflict for resources, conflict for water, conflict. It also accelerates internal displacement. The UN calculates very, very conservatively that there are about 1.1 million displaced people, internally displaced people. I think that's an underestimate. We're doing a recount, and I suspect the figure will go up dramatically. But the number of people being displaced internally is going to shoot up.
By the drought.
By the drought. I mean, I was in Belatwain about 10 days ago, and you come in from the airport, you drive into the town, and there are just huge numbers of people sitting in sort of plastic and wooden shelters, and they've come because of the drought. And I went to the livestock market. The price of livestock has collapsed to the point that it costs so much to take your livestock to the market that it's not worth them taking it back to wherever you come from, but people still don't want to buy it because they can't afford to feed it. So it's the livestock. It's not affecting the whole country equally, but it's very serious. So we are seeking a whole of international community response and a whole of UN response to the drought, not only to the humanitarian aspects, but we think that supporting the Somalis to deal with this is very important on political and security grounds as well, and to support the humanitarians while respecting their humanitarian space. And I should say I've been a humanitarian coordinator, so I know how important it is to protect that space. But, drought is more than just a humanitarian issue. But what this drought is also doing is highlighting starkly some of the problems that Somalia is facing. The capacity of local authorities and of the government to respond is very weak. And one of the reasons for that is that the state is not generating resources. Somalia is actually potentially quite a rich country. Leaving aside the prospect of oil and gas, it's one of the biggest livestock populations in the world. It's got plenty of sun, plenty of wind. It's got a couple of fantastic rivers. It's got potential energy. Somalis are great traders. They've got an amazing global network through the Diaspora. They're very good at business. But that economic activity is not translating into revenues for the state, because the state does not yet have the capacity to give the private sector what it wants most of all, which is security, rule of law, and investment in things like infrastructure, vocational training. So I think we're getting to the point where that has to be high on the agenda. But right now we have big problems of joblessness, which are going to be exacerbated by this drought. The drought is also, as I said, highlighting some of the security issues. Now, you asked me to speak a little bit about the security stuff. One of the problems facing Somalia is, there are multiple issues. First of all, as you know, we have 22,000 AMISOM troops in the country from 5 countries. Burundi, Ethiopia, Djibouti, Kenya, and Uganda. And they are in a situation in which Al-Shabab has changed tactics. AMISOM has successfully, working with Somali security forces, booted Al-Shabab out of urban areas over the last years. But Al-Shabab has now changed. It's now using cell phones to extort money. It is retreated to rural areas. It's resorted to high-profile asymmetric attacks. It's very mobile. It's very heavily social media oriented. And AMISOM is trying to figure out how best it can respond to this changing Al-Shabaab tactic. And Al-Shabaab thrives, I'm afraid, on inability of government to meet the basic needs of people, including in areas like rule of law and security. And the perpetuation of local conflicts is also creating space for Al-Shabaab. So there are a number of issues. One of them you referred to is the funding of AMISOM. That is very important. There has been a cut in funding for AMISOM by 20%. The EU has actually been very generous over the years in funding AMISOM. They did advertise a while ago that they were going to cut by 20%. That cut has kicked in, and there is a big discussion going on as to the basis upon which that 20% can be replenished, the degree to which the UN has the responsibility for doing that, the degree to which the rest of the international community might contribute on a voluntary basis. And on top of that, there have been discussions about the Burundi contingent because of concerns by the EU about what's going on in Burundi and how that affects payment of Burundi troops inside Somalia. I don't know if we want to get into the weeds on that one, probably too granular. But the issue for AMISOM, I would say, is threefold. Number one, making sure that the funding stream is predictable. Number two, that AMISOM is operationally capable and able to respond to the changing nature of the security threat. And number three, that if, as AMISOM countries say, they are going to withdraw from Somalia, that horizon is managed and that is done in an orderly way and not in a disorderly way. And the most important thing for Somalia, in my view, both from a state-building point of view, but also from a security point of view, and possibly even from an economic point of view, is that Somalis need to take primary responsibility for their own security. And that means developing security forces which are trusted by the population. So this isn't just a technical thing. This isn't about just training guys with guns. This is about, what is the political basis upon which Somalia, after 26 years, some people would say 36, 46 years of civil war, what is the political basis upon which this country that is emerging from conflict can establish an army, a police force, intelligence services, maritime forces that is acceptable to all the clans, that is acceptable to the regions, and that has the confidence of the population. And it can be done. Many of you may have worked in places like Bosnia or Lebanon or elsewhere. It is possible to build trusted security forces, but it is a political undertaking, not just an operational and military one. So I think that's got to be high on the agenda of the incoming government. What is the formula that will work, and who is going to pay for it? And I think it's really important that while the international community will continue to fund security in Somalia, the Somalis need to pay for their own security forces, which means they need to generate the revenues, which means that we've got to find a basis upon which the Somalis can start taxing economic activity, which means the state has to start delivering services that the private sector and citizens want. So now these dilemmas are they're becoming much clearer, but we've got to get to the point that we can actually tackle some of those things. We are working very closely with the African Union on something called a comprehensive approach to security, which has 4 components. One, looking at how to ensure that AMISOM is playing a full role. Secondly, approaching the building of Somali national security forces. Thirdly is extending state authority and rule of law at the local level. And even though those things need to be done for their own reasons, they're essential for security. because frankly, if you ask, as we do, Somali women or young people or, pastoralists, what is insecurity, they're not going to say it's the absence of men that we don't know with guns. They're going to say it's that there are no services, that rule of law is very weak, that the infrastructure is weak, that we don't know who to turn to in government if we want something done. So these things need to be done for security reasons as much as for other reasons. And I think the fourth strand of our comprehensive approach is looking at violent extremism and supporting Somalis to resolve local conflicts. And let me come to an end on this. As the UN, one thing I should say is the UN, it's a very integrated UN presence. We work very closely together, whether it's UNSOM, the political mission, UNSOS, the entity that supports AMISOM and the Somali National Security Forces, or the UN country team. And some people, I love coming to New York because people tell me that we're a model for this, that, or the other. And of course, we don't realize this on the ground, but maybe from a New York perspective, we are. And I think we are a model in many areas for an integrated approach. Mm-hmm. And one of them, I hope, will be insecurity. On the political side, I think having focused on state formation and elections, we now need to figure out how we can support the Somalis to resolve conflicts among them. It's not our job to do it, it's their job. But how can we help them do that? So, John, a lot of information in a short space of time. The three things you asked for. I've left out more than I've included, but let me stop there and take questions
well, that's
if there
just
are any.
Great. Really, thank you. It's been both very clear and very stark. And I kind of would like to ask you two broad questions and then open the floor up. And you've actually alluded to both of them. The first question is how this large political objective can be coordinated with these tremendous socioeconomic problems at another kind of level. So in the report here of the Secretary General, which I'm really saying is very stark and honest, it's not a kind of everything's okay kind of report. It's very stark. It says, for example, that Somalia is this incredibly poor country, GDP of $450, that more than half of Somali's labor force is looking for work, that women are outside the labor force, the youth better educated but more likely to be unemployed, that, as you've already said, domestic revenue collection is almost zilch, very, very low. 2.8% of GDP is collected in revenue. In other words, nobody pays taxes. So funding for education averages less than 5% of government budgets. The government lacks human and technical capacity to effectively manage education services. And then there's a long section here about children and the abuse and challenges that they face. So my broad question is, can the broader political objective that you have laid out of an independent, strong Somali state be achieved unless these other kinds of problems can be overcome? I'm trying to put this in very broad terms to you.
I mean, I may not answer your question directly, but I think what a lot of Somalis say to me is, we've had all this politics, we've had this electoral process, we've had this state formation process. We basically now have the architecture of the state. Is it now going to be used to achieve these objectives? So, for example, whenever I meet new parliamentarians, and I meet a lot of them, and I've been to a lot of the electoral processes, which has, by the way, been fantastic. I mean, there hasn't been an election in Somalia since 1969. So the sense of excitement that these electoral processes have generated, are very well covered by the media. But I always say to the parliamentarians, well, what's your agenda? What are your priorities? And sometimes they're very taken aback by this because they have been so absorbed in the hassle of getting themselves elected with all the clan politics that involves and who has to pay who and who has to do what, that the idea that you've actually then got to do something once you have a position of authority may or may not have occurred to them. So, but I have to say that I don't want to exaggerate, but the women parliamentarians tend to be more focused on issues than the men.
Okay.
I mean, they basically
Substance. Substance.
yeah, because I mean they look after the families and they know a lot of the problem, whereas the men are, and women too. But so I'm being unfair. I'm conscious that I have a Somali in the room, but I hope you agree with me. The men tend to be more focused on clan politics, and the women are not bad at clan politics, but they tend to be more focused on, well, how are we actually going to get some of this stuff done? But to be specific about your question, Parliament has to pass a bunch of legislation that will allow the state to be more functional. It has to pass, for example, the IMF, bless the IMF. The IMF, there is a staff-monitored program that is actually going very well. But the IMF is now saying for that staff-monitored program to continue, the state has to start generating revenues. And they have worked out that one law, if implemented, could dramatically change the situation, and that is the ICT law, whereby if the IT companies and the telephone companies were charged the minimum amount that they're charged anywhere in the world in tax, the revenues to the state would shoot up. And so the IMF is not doing this for political reasons. They're saying, listen, guys, if you want to become full members of the international community and start having a conversation about debt relief and start having a conversation about, use of IDA funding, you've got to start behaving like a state. And I think the good news is that this is now sort of dawning on everybody that this is the next step, is how do you actually... And a lot of Somalis, particularly from the diaspora, are kind of saying, duh, this has got to happen. This has got to happen. But whether we get there partly depends upon whether the next president, first of all, if there's a clear-cut result, and whether he, because it will be he, forms an administration and starts cracking through an agenda that will allow Somalia to tackle some of these problems and benefit from international private and public sector investment.
So this is where the rubber meets the road, is this kind of discussion where you and I are having here. So my second question, and thank you for your response here, has to do with the security services. So as you've already stated here, it has been the announced intent of a number of the Amazon troop contributors to draw down and ultimately leave Somalia by the end of 2018, which is somewhere like 17 months from today. And the question is whether the Somali security forces will be able to maintain security. And there was an article in one of these newspapers that said, in essence, the Somali security forces as such almost do not exist as of today, that they're the clan forces that are in different regions, that they don't really coordinate with each other, that therefore, in a nutshell, they're kind of unprepared to take over security, which then leaves the question of what will happen if Ethiopia and the others in 18 months from now say, we've had enough, we've spent all this money, lives have been lost and so on, and we don't want to do this anymore because we never promised you that we would be here for a decade or for perpetuity. Over to you. So could you say a little bit more about whether you think the state, the president to come and the parliament can actually in these 18 months pull up the security forces to take true responsibility for the security of the state?
That is the big question, and the answer has yet to be. I can't give you a definitive answer. I think the Somalis are capable of doing this, but as I was saying before, it needs to be approached as a political issue.
I agree with that.
I think that the international community is not blameless in this. Over the last 9 years, the international community has focused on training guys with guns. I mean, that's a sort of shorthand for what I'm talking about. It hasn't been focused on what are the right political arrangements that need to be in place. But it hasn't been possible before. It's now possible because you've got the states and you've got the political infrastructure. So this is the exciting thing. It is now possible to sort this out in a way that I don't think it was 3, 5, 7 years ago. Now, the countries that are talking about leaving, the troop-contributing countries, and bear in mind that 2 of those countries have troops inside Somalia who are not part of AMISOM. So, for example, Ethiopia has troops inside Somalia who are not with AMISOM, as well as troops who are with AMISOM. So the fact that AMISOM leaves doesn't necessarily mean that all foreign troops leave, because some of those foreign troops are there on the basis of an agreement with the federal government of Somalia. But I have spent time talking to some of the politicians, including heads of state and chiefs of defense forces of troop-contributing countries. And indeed, they are saying, look, we have been in Somalia basically to protect a political process, and it's now time for the Somalis to step up. And ironically, I think they would be prepared to extend their stay if they thought there was a credible plan whereby the Somalis assume greater responsibility. If there is no plan, then the incentives for them to leave will be much greater. And to give you a very concrete example of this, some of them are saying, and I'm not a military person, but I have no reason to disbelieve them, that if they take an area or a town, they shouldn't be then hanging around doing the policing. The Somalis should be doing the policing, and the Somali army should be stepping in there, and they should then move on to the next place to take on Al-Shabab. But they can't do that because the Somali police forces and Somali army are simply not equipped. So they're saying we need capable, in fact, 4 A's, able, affordable, accountable, and acceptable security forces to be there so that we can then do our job, And so, I've had the privilege of meeting most of the candidates for the presidency, and have had long discussion with the current president, who of course may come back as president, and all of them seem to be saying this is their top priority. And I would add, if I may, John, that this isn't just about security, this is about state building, because having a security forces that everybody can be proud of and everybody can relate to would be a major step forward in terms of giving Somalia a sense of statehood. And I think that's very important, learning from the mistakes of the Siad Barre era.
Well, this is a great discussion you and I are having. You're reminding me of something that my former friend and boss, Robert Oakley, said when he was the special representative of the United States there in 92, 93. And his essence, we went in a car, he said, if the Somalis want to do it,
they can do it.
Build a state. Yeah. They can do it. And if they don't want to do it, you can fill that in, everybody in this room. But if they want to do it, they can do it. The Somalis are very smart people, very smart, and they can do it. So if they want to. So I'd like to open this up and take 2 or 3 questions. If you could sort of say your name, we'll take Warren here, the lady behind you, and then one in the back, this gentleman there, and then we'll come around again. So just say your name and identify your affiliation. Warren.
It's Warren Hogue of the International Peace Institute. Mr. Keating, I'm struck by the fact that in meetings we've had here at IPI really over the past decade about Somalia and in publications, it is always commented upon that Somalis do really well when they go to other countries. That the Somali diaspora is a lot of entrepreneurial, enterprising people. So one of my questions is, are you actively trying to persuade them to come back and assist in this country building process, and are you having success in that? And then just one additional question. In the electoral process, you said you had been meeting with candidates for the presidency. Is it being impressed upon them how very important it is to live with the results? I'm thinking, of course, of Burundi and most recently of Gambia. Is that something they are aware of and is impressed upon them?
Great. So one question each, ladies and gentlemen, short questions. Please.
I'm only going to ask one question. Carolina Klose working with UNDP on the New Deal, also in Somalia. And my question is on the famous catchphrase of development humanitarian nexus. A lot of the questions you describe, problems you described were actually development challenges. And how do you start on the development agenda in such a challenging security context? And what role do you see for the National Development Plan, I believe the first one in decades? Thank you.
Terrific. And the gentleman right there in the blue sweater. And say your name and where you're from.
Yes, hi, I'm Scott Fogel from the UN Democracy Fund. I was wondering if you could briefly talk about Somaliland, the breakaway region in the north of the country.
Great. So you can synthesize your reply,
Okay.
and then we'll have another round.
Okay. The questions about the diaspora. I have to say, we don't have to persuade the diaspora to come back, because the diaspora is present and is coming back. I can't remember the exact figures, one of my colleagues might, but quite a high percentage of parliamentarians, well, it depends what you mean by diaspora, but quite a high percentage of them have second passports. And to get the second passport presumably means they've lived sufficiently long in their countries of adoption to qualify from a passport. And the biggest groups are US, UK, Canada, US, UK, Canada. I think there's smaller groups, Norway, Sweden, some Australians and so on, some Kenyans, and some from the Gulf. But it's a big group. I think something like 100 of the 275 members of parliament in the lower house, I think, have second passports. There are also diaspora coming back and investing in business and so on. But to answer your question directly, yes, I am encouraging them. I haven't done it in New York, but pretty well everywhere else I go, Canada, in Europe, in Kenya, wherever I go and meet diaspora leaders and listen to them about what it is that they're expecting and what they're doing and what they're prepared to do. So whether that's successful or not, I don't know. But many of the businesses in Somalia are run by the diaspora. The Gambia precedent, I may be proven wrong, but I don't think it's a problem in Somalia. In 2012, Sheikh Sharif, the incumbent president, left within minutes. I mean, he just handed over power. The current president, as I say, he may come back, but he's said that if he doesn't get elected, he will hand over power. And this is not being raised as something that is likely. I have to say, my brief experience working in Somalia is that Somalis have these incredibly vigorous political arguments which you worried are going to turn violent, and then somebody wins them, and then just everybody accepts the result and moves on. That seems to be part of the political culture. So I'm not too worried about that. In terms of the development agenda in such a challenging environment, well, it's remarkable that there is a national development plan. It's the first one, I think, in 30 years, is it? Or first one ever, actually. I think it's the first one Somalia has ever had. And a big issue is whether the incoming government will associate itself fully with that NDP. And if it does, how it can then be implemented. In my view, one of the best places, you said, where do you start? One of the best places to start is what actually works. What is working, and how can that be scaled up in things like local governance, and things like revenue generation, in things like health provision, and so on. And it is not, as the head of the UN, of course, I guess I have a responsibility, indirect responsibility for everything, but I'm not following this as closely as some of my colleagues. But one of the things that I do think we need to do more in Somalia is take calculated, mitigated risks to empower Somalis to manage their own affairs, including on the development front. And there is, I think, a global culture of accountability for understandable reasons. But in a place like Somalia, if you're not prepared to give Somalis the opportunity to manage their own affairs and live with some of the risks associated with that, then I don't think we'll be testing what is actually possible, including in areas like local governance. But I think the big issue is revenue generation. I mean, as I discussed with my Somali friends and colleagues, they want Somalia to be a sovereign state, but you can't be a sovereign state if you are entirely dependent upon others for your revenues. I mean, you can talk about it. And by the way, one of the good things about the electoral process is that the Somalis paid something like 30% of it through candidate registration fees. And that's great. It's their process. I mean, many countries in the world, the host country pays 10% or 5%. To pay 30% is quite a good one. In terms of Somaliland, clearly, I mean, the first thing to say about Somaliland is it is very seriously affected by the drought, really badly affected, and the drought is actually already impacting the Somaliland elections. I think behind your question is the politics. As you know, the African Union has determined it does not recognize Somaliland as a separate country, so it is, it is a difficult situation. I think what we are all hoping for is that once there is a new federal government in place and perhaps a new government of Somaliland in place, there will be renewed efforts to organize a sustained conversation between Somaliland and Somalia, starting with all the issues that they have in common, such as drought. But there's all sorts of issues, environmental issues, revenues from overhead flights, livestock issues, standards, security. The conversation about, is Somaliland and Somalia going to be rejoined politically, that is going to take, whether that happens at all is going to take some time. But I think a first step is a more deliberate and sustained conversation between Somaliland and Somalia on the issues they have in common, rather than on the issues that divide them.
So, great. Let's take another round. This gentleman and the lady there, and I guess Jeffrey. And then we'll try to get one more round in before we wrap this up. We're going to wrap it up at 25 after 2, so that we can have a conversation that can be recorded and put out for everybody. So please, just identify yourself and a short question, please.
Hi, thanks. My name is Kevin Kelly. I write for the Nation Media Group in Kenya. So 10 years of Amazon, 10 years of warfare with Shabab, and Shabab remains a very aggressive, very potent force, obviously. As part of a political process, could there not be negotiations with Al-Shabab? Is there no basis politically for Shabab to play a role in the future of Somalia? They must have some sort of base, right?
Okay.
And the Islamic court unions as a possible predecessor to what we see today, by some accounts, there was effective governance under that brief period. Elements of Shabab come out of that. So thank you.
Thank you. The lady there, just identify yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Tanya Bernath. I'm a consultant, and I'm working on a project now in Somalia. And just wanted to know about efforts that the UN's taking to discourage young people and so on from joining Al-Shabab. Just wanted to hear about that, and also some of the reintegration challenges that you're facing and what the UN is doing about that.
Yeah, and why do young people join it in the first place, and so on. So, Jeffrey.
Thank you, John. Jeff Laurenti, and this is the Al-Shabaab
Where are you
round,
from, Jeffrey? Tell you have a affiliation?
Well, I'm a contributor to Huffington Post.
Okay, good. Okay.
Here's the query on Al-Shabaab. What is it that is sustaining it after this many years? Has it maintained, or is it losing what had been whatever was the ideological ingredient that helped motivate people? What is its source of revenue generation in contrast to the wannabe Somali state? And what are its means for recruiting new warm bodies into its ranks? And the effectiveness of its governance in those areas that it has the upper hand in?
So all three questions really are about Al-Shabab one way or another, please.
Okay, ideally, the answers to these questions should be rooted in a crystal clear understanding of what Al-Shabab currently is. And somebody said, what are we doing? Well, one of the things we are doing is inviting both Somali and international scholars to help us answer that question. I mean, there are many people who have views on this. So, next time I come back, I'll probably be in a position to give you a much clearer picture of it, because it is evolving. But subject relatively small in terms of numbers, but it's very hardcore and very and quite extremist, with views about what constitutes a child, what constitutes a civilian, what constitutes legitimacy, what constitutes justice, and so on. And you will be familiar. It's no different with Al-Shabab than it is with many other extremist groups. Then there is probably a much bigger group of people whose association with Al-Shabab may have, an ideological component to it, but is probably more to do with the benefits, particularly economic and financial, that an association with Al-Shabab may bring. And then I think there's probably a third group who basically can get jobs through Al-Shabab in a way that they can't get, elsewhere, including, I'm afraid, some young people and so on. In terms of what sustains Al-Shabab, I think I've already alluded. My understanding, subject to further investigation of this, is that the oxygen that sustains Al-Shabab is from disputes between clans, maybe between businesses, even between some of these emerging states. And these disputes go unresolved and they fester, and Al-Shabab is able to move into the space, often on the side of the underdog, as it were, and exploit them for its own purposes. And that is not the only reason, but it is one of the reasons why we need to prioritize local dispute resolution. And I would say that there are at least 7 or 8 very serious disputes within Somalia that have the potential for serious violence involving many deaths, huge displacement, and so on. The one that is preoccupying me most at the moment is in Galkayo, and we're heavily involved in that. And when I talk to the local governors and mayors and business people, they say one of the things they find most terrifying is that if they do not resolve this dispute, it's already happening, Al-Shabab will come in and offer support to one group over another. So it's a clear entry point. But I think there are also other deficits that Al-Shabaab exploits, including, justice. I think where there are disputes and, people, for various reasons, sometimes because they don't trust the formal justice system or that the tribal justice system isn't necessarily going to work, they will turn to Al-Shabab, which does provide very quick, often quite brutal decisions, but it's really clear. And often what people want is speed and predictability, even if they're not going to get into the details of whether the justice system itself is appropriate. And so I think they're able to exploit these things. I think they're making quite a lot of money out of taxing trade, but also I think intimidation. intimidation of businesses, intimidation of politicians, intimidation of anybody who has money or who needs protection, and where they are in a position to threaten. In terms of efforts to discourage young people from joining Al-Shabab, funny enough, I was with Leila Zarougi just this morning talking about exactly this. It is a really tough one. I mean, how do you, I mean, first of all, on the government side, it's much clearer what we need to try and do, including get the Convention of the Rights of the Child ratified, get much broader acceptance that the age of a child is 18 and not 16, and so on. So, you know, that is happening, and the Somalis are actually being very responsive to that, but it will take time. On the Al-Shabab side, it's much tougher. I mean, how do you persuade violent extremists that recruitment of young people is unacceptable? Do you work through religious networks? Do you try and shame them? And because all these kids have parents, and if the parents think that Al-Shabab is behaving in ways that is worse than the people they're fighting. I mean, you know, there are various ways in which you can try and do this, but I won't pretend it's easy. One of the things we are doing is supporting the authorities to develop a prevention or countering violent extremism national strategy, and this is definitely part of that. And then the last question, have I answered them all or not? Oh yeah, talking to Al-Shabab. You know, the drought is highlighting the need to engage with Al-Shabab, because Al-Shabab controls areas in which large numbers of people live. And you know, a big question is, how can you engage with Al-Shabab to ensure humanitarian life-saving assistance? But you know, maybe there's a case for engaging Al-Shabab on things like not recruiting young people. Yeah. In terms of political direct discussions with Al-Shabab, that we are not there yet. There have been various attempts in the past, you know, to do this, but and there are various legal restrictions on what you can and cannot do. The point is often made that many Al-Shababis have actually joined the political mainstream. In fact, one of the more effective state presidents himself was in Al-Shabab. So, you know, one of the options is to try and encourage Al-Shabab to convert violence into politics, but that is a very controversial course of action. And I think it does come back to what I started with, is who are they? Because some of them you're never going to be able to do that, but others you might be able to do it if those who support it for their own reasons see a better future by supporting the state than by fighting.
So we're going to have the last comment. One second, madam. 1 second. We're going to have the lady there, but first the gentleman here, and then you get the last question. Very short. Oh, wait, there's one. You want to ask a question from there? This is Hillary Saviello, who runs our social media.
Okay. So one
question from outside, and then yourself, and then this gentleman. Go ahead, Hillary. Hillary.
Thank you. There's interest in Somaliland on Facebook. Specifically, someone asked whether the drought affecting the eastern regions deserves more UN attention to ensure that the elections occur in a timely manner. And second question from Facebook, how is the UN handling the interference of Ethiopia and Kenya in Somalia?
And now the lady there, what's your...
Yeah, Mara Hena, Réseau Femmes International. You mentioned that there are 25% women in the parliament. I wonder, is it based on quota, or is it enforced or imposed by the UN, or is it like a social transformation in your mind? And is there anything under some Shabab? Is there any women?
Okay, great.
You know? representing. Thank you.
Say your name.
Hi, thank you. My name is Gaith Zubi from 1267 Sanctions Monitoring Team. My question is, what's your take, Mr. Keating, on the situation on the Portland Barry Mountain? And do you think it has any kind of regional impact, namely Yemen? Thank you.
What's happening with this mountain?
Portland Mountain, Barry Mountains.
Candler.
Yeah, the situation there with the group of Abdul Qadir Mu'min.
Yeah.
And the split from Al-Shabab. Thank you.
Last question. The gentleman right there. Short question.
George Baumgarten from the UN Press Corps. Firstly, just so I understand correctly, we are dealing with a country that has never had other than a unicameral legislature, one house, and it's being recrafted and reorganized in such a way that you will now have a bicameral legislature. And just to touch on Al-Shabab again, do I understand correctly? I would like to have a sort of geostrategic update. They control nothing in roughly the northern half of the country, but they control a good part of the southern part of the country other than within Metro Mogadishu.
Okay, that's it.
Okay, some big questions to end with. Should the UN do more for the drought? I mean, of course, everybody should do more. We are going to do everything we can in a very competitive global environment to mobilize resources for the drought response. I think a second issue is to remove the impediments so that money can get to those who can best use it, whether as remittances or assistance. But also there's an issue of making sure that the money can buy things like water and food. I have to say the UN is not the only player in terms of drought response, but working with local authorities and governmental authorities is really important. So the seriousness with which Somaliland is taking this is commendable, because there does need to be a genuine partnership around this. So, but I think, the fact that, I am using my political role to draw attention to this and to see what we can do to support the humanitarians on the political and security side, I hope is an indication of how seriously we're taking it all. The second question, the 25%, this is a Somali decision. It was a 30% quota set by the Somalis. If the UN had been asked, we would have said 50%. So it is not us, as you put it, forcing them. This is their quota. A lot of people thought 30% was crazily ambitious. And of course, it's disappointing we haven't got to 30%. But actually, getting to 25% from 14, which was on the basis of tribal elders choosing 14%, to 25% being elected, is a huge jump. Is it a social transformation? The question is this irreversible or is it reversible? I think it's irreversible. I think that women are going to show that they have a massive contribution to make to politics, and if we get to one person, one vote, rather than another system, and of course getting to one person, one vote is not guaranteed, because all sorts of things need to be in place before that happens. So I think there could be a genuine social transformation has taken place as a result of a Somali set quota that we have gone out of our way to support, we, the international community. But we've done that by supporting the women themselves. We haven't been forcing anybody to do anything. We've just been supporting women's groups and trying to make sure that the model is female friendly. The third question was about Puntland. I mean, I think it does need to be taken very seriously. What people who know these things much better than I do tell me is that one of the things Al-Shabab is concerned about is the alternative brand that, that ISIS wants to demonstrate, that particularly to young people, that it can do things that others can't. The Puntland authorities are also convinced that a lot of this is about tribal politics, clan politics, and that ISIS is exploiting clan politics. but I am reluctant just to put it down to a clan dispute. I mean, I think there's more than that possibly going on, and even if it isn't, we've got to take it very, very seriously, and I think the authorities in Puntland are taking it seriously. And I think that, by the way, they're saying they've got the situation under control. That's the last I heard, but you know, look at the map, and it remains an area that is vulnerable to. And then there was the question about interference of neighbors. Wow, that's a big question that could go on forever. What is the UN doing? All I can say is that we have the most Somali-friendly or Somali-invested Security Council in a very long time. I think 10 of the 15 members of the Security Council are seriously involved in Somalia, including from the African continent, Egypt, and Ethiopia. Clearly, what we, as the international community, are doing is encouraging all Somalia's partners to take this electoral process very seriously. Even though they have their own interests, we believe that investment in this electoral process will be the best way for the Somalis to choose their own leadership, and that is a much healthier way of doing it than trying to influence things so that, you know, that somebody emerges who's seen as having emerged on the basis of you know, either money or foreign influence or bribery or corruption or intimidation. Let's invest in that electoral process. And then the very last question was what? I've forgotten it. Oh, the geopolitical update is the last question. I'm trying to remember what the question was.
He
Sorry.
wanted to know where Shabab's area of operation.
Yeah. Well, you know, the humanitarians who have to have a granular understanding of where you can and cannot move stuff around for their own reasons will tell you that they are in rural areas, mostly in South and Southwest Somalia. They do have influence in some urban areas, but they do not control territory in urban areas. But they do have mobility, and they do have, as I was saying before, other means of influencing.
Well, this has been a very valuable discussion, and first of all, thanks to all of you who asked questions. I really want to thank and express our appreciation to you, Michael. I thought this was a tremendously straightforward and open and direct discussion about the challenges that Somalia faces, the real challenges, the need for specific concrete actions and decisions by the Somali parliament and the incipient government, the president-to-be, and you know, your clear statement of the engagement of Security Council, but beyond that, the Secretariat, and in particular yourself and the new Secretary General. So, you know, the one word I was going to throw in is the word governance. So much of what we have described here is the need for good governance. And where there's good governance, people are not trying to cross the Mediterranean and drowning. And when there's no good governance, that's where they all are coming from, who are drowning in the Mediterranean. So that's the challenge for all of us. So really appreciation to you. Let's give him a big...
Thank you. Thank you.
Terrific. Very good.